My talk will deal with the problem of cross-linguistic word order variation and the possible theory to account for what orders are eventually attestable, possible, and those that are not attested and cannot be found. So in the first part, I will try to show the essential properties and generalizations that relate to word order, and especially two things, the partial regularities that are found and the non-existence of certain word orders, which is also very crucial. In the second part, I will instead try to sketch a possible theory, as I said, of word order variation, what is found in the languages of the world, and towards the end of a restrictive theory, namely, as I hinted at before, what can be actually found, what is attested, and what cannot be found. Well, one preliminary thing to note is the distinction, a very well-known distinction between the canonical or neutral orders of the language and the special orders that express specific functions like focus, topic, movement to special positions, and so on. For example, I gave a couple examples here. In Bangla and in Chinese, which have the order of the nominal phrase, demonstrative, numeral, adjective, noun, the adjective can also be found preceding the demonstrative. This is not possible in English, not possible in Italian. It's possible in certain languages, but if you want to highlight or focalize the adjective. Now, as an example of the type of variety one finds of the canonical word orders, let me give a couple of cases. So in one, you see the order that is found in Bulgarian of demonstrative, numeral, adjective, noun, but also in English, in Dravidian languages, in many other languages. In two, you see the almost mirror image, the mirror image of the Bulgarian order, which is actually the most popular order found in the languages of the world, where the noun precedes the adjective, then the numeral follows, and then the demonstrative. In three, you see another case where the relative order of demonstrative, numeral, and adjective is the same as that in Bulgarian, but the noun precedes demonstrative, numeral, adjective rather than following it. In four, you see instead the case of the demonstrative preceding the noun and adjective and numeral following in that order. And in five, in another language, you see the demonstrative preceding the noun, numeral and adjective follow, but in the inverse order. So there are many. Now, in the case of word order in clauses, in sentences, the variation is extreme in the sense that there are so many more things in the clause rather than in the nominal phrase, like auxiliaries, modals, adverbs, subordinators, and so on, that complicates things, but the logic of the matter is the same as the simpler one that we're going to see for the nominal phrase. A couple of examples again. If you take Japanese, you see an almost mirror image of the English order. So in Japanese, rather than the sequence, I said that he can do it well. You find something like I, he, it, well, do, can, say, that, said. So you see that it's an inverse order. The second case is contrast Italian and Malagasy. Italian is a non-perfect ad initial language where the verb precedes the object. And the adverbs that follow have the same order as in English and Bulgarian, with no longer preceding always, preceding well, as opposed to what you find in Malagasy, which is a strict, rigid head initial language, where the adverbs are actually in the mirror image, so that you find after the object, you find well, always, no longer, in the inverted order. Now, the differences that we have seen so far have no consequence on interpretation. So the Japanese sentence means the same as the English sentence, and the same for the Italian and Malagasy cases. So the question now is, are there principal limits to what we see in the variation of this order, which does not seem to have any consequence for interpretation? And to begin with, I think we should consider what I said at the beginning, the existence of partial regularities and the existence of certain impossible orders that are not found. And both have been actually prominently pointed out by Greenberg, who is the initiator of the typological school. And the partial regularities that you can see, for example, in 8, where it was noted by him and others that followed him, you have a correlation to a very large extent between the order of the object with respect to the verb and the order of the lexical verb with respect to the auxiliary. So you see in 8a, there are many more language families that respect this correlation, and the opposite correlation, which is also coherent, namely where the object follows the verb, the lexical verb also follows the auxiliary. Where you don't respect this correlation, you find that the families of languages are much rarer. And the same for the modal case. Now, when you mix two projections, like the clause and the nominal phrase, the correlations are much weaker. Whereas what we saw earlier, if you consider the same projection, the clause, the correlations are much stronger. So if you take, for example, 11, you see that there is not much of a difference if you consider the position of the object with respect to the verb and the position, let's say, of a numeral with respect of the noun. So we are dealing now with two independent projections. And here, there do not seem to be any particular correlations for these cases. And I cite a couple of extreme cases, one Papuan language in 12, where within the clause, you find the head final order with the verb final and all the complements and the adjuncts preceding, whereas in the nominal phrase, the language is head initial. That's completely opposite. And in this Mayan language in 13, you find the opposite, namely in the sentence, the verb is head initial, in the nominal, the noun is head final. So actually the rigid or consistent head final and head initial languages like Japanese that I mentioned, or Malagasy, Japanese being an extreme head final language, and Malagasy an extreme head initial language, are actually, and this is a puzzle, which I have no real, nobody I think has a real answer. It's actually a minority. These are the most coherent, consistent languages are a minority in the general panorama and are never totally consistent. Even Japanese has some few inconsistencies within its grammar. And so this means that possibly each language differs from all other language, every other language in word order type. There is no real complete perfect systematization. Now, the second point that I mentioned is the non-existence of certain orders. This is also crucial for a theory of word order. Why certain orders are never found. And I start with the orders of degree adverb, let's say an intensifier like very in English, an adjective, and a noun. There are, mathematically speaking, 6 potential combinations, but only 4 are actually attested. And you see them in 14. This was noted already for the first 3 in Greenberg's famous article in 1963, where he had actually 14a, the order degree adverb adjective noun, as in English, 11 languages in his sample. In 14b, you have noun, adjective, degree adverb, 8 languages. Then you have 14c with 2 languages, the order, if you want in Italian, noun, degree adverb, adjective. But there is also the order which is rarer, we'll see why, possibly, in 14d, where you have adjective, degree adverb, noun. What you don't find systematically is the orders in E and F, adjective, noun, degree adverb, or degree adverb, noun, adjective. The same is true for orders of numeral classifiers, and noun. Numeral classifiers are morphemes that are obligatory following a cardinal number in some languages or optionally in others. Well, for example, Bulgarian duši is an optional classifier when you say trima duši studenti, trima duši rabotnici, or something. Now, here again, you find the same pattern. There are 4 attested orders: numeral classifier, noun, Chinese, or noun classifier numeral, some Austronesian languages. You also find 15c, noun classifier, noun numeral classifier, but you also find the rarer case of classifier numeral noun. What you don't find, once again, are the E and F cases where the noun intervenes between the two. So you can already imagine why. Now, the task, as I was saying, of a theory of word order variation should be of accounting for what are the possible tested orders and what are the impossible ones, whether they conform to the head initial, head final types, or they don't, to varying degrees, as I said. And the first step in developing such a theory is to single out, to try to individuate what could be at the basis of word order. And I'm going to argue that what is responsible ultimately for word order variation is actually movement, the possibility of a certain piece of projection of the noun or the verb in a sentence to move, and crucially with a certain restriction. Now, to see this, let's consider one rather well-known case of a particular semantic or cognitive hierarchy that has been found from many years from now, where it was actually stated or individuated that objective types of adjectives are closer to the noun than less objective ones. So if you pick 3 classes like value, size, and color, a number of people have suggested, psycholinguists and linguists, that color adjectives are more objective in a sense, like red or black, than size, if you think of small or medium, is a little more subjective. Certainly value or quality is clearly more subjective than color and size. And what are the orders that you find? These are in 16 and 17. So you find that color is closer to the noun, whether the adjective precedes, as in 16, that's English, or follow, as in Indonesian or in other languages. And in fact, I gave here a number of languages which actually have these orders of these, which are very clearly stated in the grammars of these languages. They give the orders of the different classes of adjectives, in this case, color, size, value. And the noun, color, size, value, as you see from a little more languages here, is actually more popular than the other order. Now, in spite of this, there are languages that were pointed out by one typologist, Franz Planck, who was at Constance University, now retired and is in Oxford. He pointed out that this semantic or cognitive hierarchy seems to be contradicted by certain languages. He gave the case of Maltese, but there are other languages that behave like Maltese, where color is most distant from the noun. It should be closer according to the hierarchy, but is most distant. But he also pointed out that the case, the inverted case where color, size, and value precede the noun, that as in 19, this is never found. Whereas the case in 18 is found. And he actually, very surprisingly for a typologist, I dare say, he mentioned the possibility of regularizing this case by assuming that the case of Maltese, where you had the apparent color more distant from the noun, could actually be due to the noun moving fronting to the front of at the beginning of the whole sequence. And he actually says, it is only on such an abstract analysis that the iconic explanation of the relative distance of semantic classes can be upheld. So he explicitly said that, which is more, common as an assumption in generative grammar, but he pointed it out in a different framework. Of course, when I say movement, we have to clearly put some limits on what can move and how it can move, just to avoid generating or allowing orders that are never found, like the order in 19 that we saw earlier. Now, if you assume that, and there are other orders that also never found, I simply listed them here. Now, the restriction on movement, one first restriction on movement, which appears to discriminate between the possible and impossible orders, is at only the head of the construction, the engine of the movement, so to speak. Here the noun, the verb in the case of the sentence, can move along the hierarchy, along the modifiers that are found in this hierarchy in a particular order of scope, where color is closer to the noun, then you have size, and then you have value. So if you assume that only the noun can move and nothing else, then the order in 19 that we can be ruled out, because here, you can see it now, is at the very beginning. If you move the adjective, let me see if I can get rid of this part. No. No. I did even worse. Let me see if I get rid of this. I did something. I wanted to show the first lines here, getting rid of that. Hmm? Can you get rid of this?
I can't.
No, I should have known that. Anyway, what the arrow that you see there, you don't see what moves, would be the case of the adjective of color moving by itself to the front, which would give rise to an impossible order because it was the adjective that moved rather than the only thing that can move, namely the head of the construction, the noun. And now the question is, how can the head of the construction move? What are the possibilities of movement? And here we have some help because we know from other clear cases of movement, the movement of WH phrases, like who, what in English, or koi, kako in Bulgarian, when they move, that they can move in three possible ways. They can move by themselves, as you see in 22a, island, who you have certainly seen pictures of. Here, only the element which is involved in the movement, the WH, can move by itself. Or it can move, as you see in 22b and c, within a larger phrase, in 22b, in a phrase that contains non-WH elements preceding the WH, and in 22c, non-WH elements that follow. And these are called pipe-pipings in the generative literature, and pictures of whom, in the case of 22b, and whose pictures piping. Now, the noun, which is the engine of the movement, just like the WH is the engine of the movement, should be able to move in the same three ways. And that is what allows you to get the orders that are actually found and exclude the orders that are not found. So if you see in 23, if the noun moves by itself without pipe-piping, namely without bringing along other material and across the various modifiers, then you get the order noun, value, size, color, because the noun climbed up across the lower adjective, then climbed up alone across the next one, and then up to the last position, giving the apparently more strange order. If it moves in one of the two pipe-pipings way, namely carrying along material, which in this case is higher than, that's the pictures of whom. So the pictures of whom take something which is actually commanding it, let's say preceding it. And here the noun, the engine, moves into the first step of the movement, bringing along the first modifier without crossing over it, because it moves in the pictures of whom type of movement. In the second case, the noun goes on in the same way, and now it brings along, without crossing over it, the next modifier up, which is the size adjective, and so on with the value. And this movement gives you the order of Bulgarian, Bangla, English, Malayalam, so many other languages. If you choose the other pipe-piping, then you get a different order, because now the noun moves by dragging along something which follows. Here, the first step, there is nothing that follows, so it's a vacuous movement by the whose picture pipe-piping. But once the noun moves to the first step above the modifier, just like before, it continues, and now it drags along the adjective that it had crossed over. So the noun, once it goes to the notch above a adjective of color, it continues above the adjective of size, bringing along the adjective of color. And this ultimately, if we go to the top notch, goes the order, noun, adjective of color, size, value, reversing entirely the orders that we started with a value higher up than size, than color, than noun. If you move it up in this way, you simply invert the order. Now, the picture, I'm going to skip something here. There are other cases that are also found, and we can... Actually, I forgot to say that the text of this talk is going to appear in a new open access journal of the University of Plovdiv. It's called Linguistica Interpretația Concepții. And now, in case, because I won't be able to show the whole thing here. So the other orders that are also found can actually be derived by a mixture of the three ways the engine can move, namely by itself or by one of the two pictures, whose pictures by piping or pictures of whom by piping. If you combine them, then you obtain other orders. And this is what actually, I'll skip here. I gave a couple of that you can find in the. Now, this approach of word order variation might look a little bit artificial in a sense, or unmotivated. But there are a number of considerations that I think really strengthen it. The first is that it allows to derive all the attested orders that you find in the languages of the world from one and the same hierarchy. So you don't postulate different, to start with. Languages don't start in different ways. They start from exactly the same hierarchy. They simply differ in the way they move the engine of the head of the construction, so to speak. The second consideration is that with the important restriction that I mentioned, that only the head of the projection, the noun or the verb, can move in one of the possible ways that we saw, we, as I said, we may discriminate between possible and impossible orders. So that's the main task of a theory of word order. And movement, I think, allows you to discriminate what you should expect to be possible and found and what should be impossible. The third consideration is that the movement options that we saw are independently motivated because they are found in other areas of the grammar. For example, in WH movement constructions, whether it's interrogative WH movement or relative WH movement, there is a movement and it moves in exactly one of those three ways. So again, this is something that renders more plausible the idea that movement is involved. And fourth and foremost, the movement approach to word order variation carries over to other domains. So there are other cases that show the same pattern that we saw now with adjectives, and we'll see with other cases. The same pattern of possible and impossible orders, namely, only one order to the left of the head, the noun or the verb, and more orders to the right. This is one generalization that has to be captured by any theory of word order. It's something that does not follow from a trivialization of linearization, where one could say the physics of speech allows you only to put something before or after something else. That's not enough, because actually you find some generalizations like this left-right asymmetry that don't follow from the physics of speech, so to speak. And here I give a number very quickly, a number of other domains that show exactly the same left-right asymmetry. So to the left of the verb, in this case, you find a particular order of adverbs that I already mentioned earlier, with no longer always completely in that order preceding the verb, English, Chinese, Bulgarian. Italian shows the same order, but after the verb. It's one of the possibilities, actually. And Malagasy shows the mirror image order after the verb. And now we know what happened, why there is this difference, because the Italian case, it was the verb that moved across the adverbs without inverting their order, skipping over them. Whereas Malagasy applied the pictures, the whose picture by piping, taking the verb, moving across the lower one, then taking, namely completely, then taking verb plus completely across always, and then these two across no longer. So this is one, you don't find, it's never found, an order such as 28b, where you have the inverse or mirror image order before the verb. This is noted by a number of people. Now, the same, exactly the same pattern is found in the relative order of adjunct PPs, like time, place, and manner. One should be careful because this can also move for another reason, for focus, which may complicate things. But people have actually shown in these works, grammatical works, that in the canonical word order, you do find the order time, place, manner preceding the verb. This is in Basque, in South American language, in German actually, and possibly in Bulgarian as well, in the canonical. You do find the same relative order of time, place, manner after the verb, 29c, and you find, once again, the mirror image after the verb. Verb, manner, place, time, but you don't find the mirror image before the verb. So there is always a gap in this pattern. The same pattern also was already implicitly given by Greenberg in his Universal 20, where he said that the order of demonstrative numeral and adjective is the only one found preceding the noun, whereas after the noun, you either find the same one, 30c, or you find the mirror image one. Now, you see, it's a very recursive kind of picture that we find in all domains, in many domains. Now, this case is even more telling because we have exhaustive evidence of all the possible and impossible combination of these four elements, which are 24 possibilities, mathematically speaking, but only 14 of these orders are found. And the sample now is over 2,200, although I gave a sample, a smaller one. And this is the essential sample. Now, the orders that are in boldface are derived in the same way of the orders that we saw with the adjectives. Value, size, color, noun, or noun, color, size, value, or noun, value, size, color. Now here, instead of adjectives, we have demonstrative, numeral, and a single adjective. But the pattern is the same. And the other orders of the 14, which are found in the, not in boldface, are, although I cannot show it here, are derivable by the same mixture of combinations of moving just the head of the construction or in one of the two piping ways. And you get the other orders. What you don't get are the orders, the 10 or orders that are never found. Because these do not involve movement of the engine, the noun, but involve movement of other pieces which are not possible by themselves. So the restriction that only the head of the projection can move, and within its projection, clearly, not going into the projection of some other head, proves instrumental in deriving the 14 attested orders of demonstrative, numeral, adjective, and noun, and without deriving, crucially, the 10 unattested ones. So, in a sense, we have a way to derive what Greenberg had just given as a generalization. He said, this is what we find, but why is it? And how can we discriminate what we find from what we don't find? And movement in these ways, I think, is the way. Now, I think we have also an answer to why we don't find the orders that you remember at the beginning, degree of adjective, noun, degree, adverb, or degree, adverb, noun, adjective in 33, whereas the other orders are possible. And here it's pretty plausible that the answer to this question is the fact that we are dealing now not with just one projection, but with two projections, where degree, adverb, and adjective form a constituent, form a unit, where the head of the projection is the adjective, whereas the noun is the head of the larger projection. Now, in 33A, the two heads move in the same way, in unison, and are found at the end with the pictures of whom piping, and that's fine. In 33B, they move again in unison. They are found at the beginning of their own projection. And in 33C and D, they move in a non-unison way. One moves in one way, the adjective in 33C moves with the pictures of whom piping without crossing over its modifier, but the noun moves with the other piping, crossing over its modifier. And the 33D is the opposite. So within the adjectival phrase containing the adjective and the degree adverb, the adjective moves in one way, crossing over its modifier, but the noun does not, moves in the pictures of whom way. The two impossible orders now come out as natural, because to get that orders, you should allow the noun to penetrate inside a projection which is not its own projection. It's the projection of another head. So there is no way you could actually derive those orders. And the same is true, the same pattern with the numeral classifier and noun. Now, how much more time? Well, because I'm going to skip something later. Okay. Because I think there is a way also to account for the different numerosities of these orders, at least to a certain extent, I think, by looking at the type of movement that has derived a certain order. Now, we know independently, again, looking at the WH movement construction, that the pictures of whom piping is more marked, whatever reason, I put it to the side, than the whose picture pipe. This we know if we look at, for example, English 36, 37, and 38. Because here we see that in main clause interrogatives, there is no problem in fronting whose picture, the WH within a larger, but with the whose picture pipe. So you can say, whose pictures do you keep in your wallet? What is very marked for some people is impossible, is pictures of whom do you keep in your wallet? Apparently, very few people find it very marginal, but don't exclude it, although others exclude it completely. What everybody excludes is the embedded case. So it's the case in 37, where the WH actually moves to the front of the embedded clause under the verb of interrogation. And the 38 gives the case of a restrictive relative clause, which is again very clearly showing that the pictures of whom type of piping is so marked that leads to an ungrammaticality. Now, this, if we consider this, I think we have the basis of accounting for the fact that certain orders are really very rare. And let me just go to the case of 33B, 33A, B, C, and D. You remember what we just saw, that these are the four orders that are found. These are possible. They obey, they comply with the types of restrictions on movement, namely that only the head can move in one of the three possible ways. But there is a difference in the sense that the first two are actually more frequent as orders than the third, and clearly of the fourth. Now, especially if we go back to, let me go back to the order of adjective, numeral, and demonstrative, we see, you almost see that, the first order, which the one derived by consistent application, regular application of the whose picture piping, which inverts the orders, is represented by 631 language and 136, I don't remember exactly, families of languages. Whereas the other, the B case, which is derived by the pictures of whom piping, because here the noun does not cross over its modifiers, is represented by fewer languages and especially fewer language families. So that already shows that even there is a reflection of the markedness of the two pipings that we see here. Now, if we go back to the case of noun, adjective, and degree adverb, the first two, as I was saying, are more frequent, especially the first one, where both the adjective and the noun move in the same whose picture piping in a consistent way. Less frequent is the case where they both move, but coherently, both in the same way, with the pictures of whom piping. But now look at the cases where the two heads move in inconsistent ways, namely where the adjectives in 33C moves with the pictures of whom piping in the inner projection, the one that makes up a modifier of the nominal projection, and the noun moves with the other type of piping, crossing over its modifier. And then the 33D, you have the opposite situation, namely the adjective, the head of the inner projection modifier of the noun, moves with the whose picture piping, crossing over its degree adverb modifier, whereas the noun moves with the more marked pictures of whom piping, which does not make the noun cross over its modifier. Now, here we see that there is a difference then between 33C and D. Even though both of them apply in inconsistent ways, the two heads, the fourth order changes from a less marked case in the inner projection, where the adjective moves across its modifier, whereas the outer projection, the noun, moves with a more marked case of pictures of whom. So we can capitalize on this switch from a less marked to a more marked in the derivation of the order, which might be at the basis of why this order is less popular than other orders. That's the essential idea. Exactly the same thing. Recall that actually Greenberg did not record the existence of 33D, which is actually found, but is very rare. The same is true of the numeral classifier noun, which has the same pattern, with 34D being the least attested order, although it is attested. Now, let me skip over these two other, these are more theory internal generative grammar, the final of a final condition and the head final filter, which are generalizations of different type of orders, but which I try to claim are exactly another instantiations of the same pattern. So let me just skip those. And towards the end, let me sketch how the restriction that I mentioned earlier, namely that only the head of a projection can move in one of the possible ways, and it can move only within its projection. It cannot move out or into another projection. Now, with this restriction, we may build a more restrictive theory of canonical word order. So consider, to show this, consider the addition of a fifth element to the order demonstrative, numeral, adjective, and noun, which is 4 elements. Now let's add a fifth element, like a classifier. Now, by factorial 5, mathematically speaking, now you have 120 different possibilities. Yet, if we start from the orders that are actually attested of the demonstrative, numeral, adjective, and noun, which are 14, and if you take the classifier and the numeral to constitute a projection, like Greenberg had actually claimed, and there is the possibility to show that they make up a really constituent, then you can not have 120 possibilities, but just 28, which are a combination of the 14 plus adding the fifth, adding this new projection where the head can be preceding or following its modifier, then you get to 28 possibilities, not 120. Let me show. And in fact, I could come to where the A prime, B prime, C prime. Now here you have 14 orders of demonstrative, numeral, adjective, and noun, and we added now a classifier. But the classifier is not an independent modifier of the noun. It's the head of a constituent whose modifier is the numeral. So Greenberg called it classifier P, classifier phrase. And if that is true, then you expect to find 28 possibilities. I could only find 26. And 2 are not yet found, I hope. They are attested, and these are given in 38 up to. So the case I could not find are the 38 E prime, A and M classifier num, and the 38 O, A and numeral classifier them, but should exist because the classifier could either precede as in O prime or follow the numeral as in O. That's the idea. Now, if you imagine this is a calculation, I mean, an investigation on languages that I did not carry out, but just imagine if you added a sixth element. So if you added a complex numeral, like 300 rather than just 3, where you have a multiplier, 3, and a base, 100. Now, these also plausibly form a constituent. So what you expect is that the base, which is the head, can be found after the multiplier. So you find 300 like in English, or before. And there are many languages which have 103 to mean 300. Now, if these form a constituent, then again, we expect to find very fewer languages as possible than simply the factorial number of combinations, which would be 720. And you would get to 56. So again, you see that the prediction is that the languages that you're going to find only have that particular possibility and are much fewer than any combination of elements. Not to speak of if you get to 10 elements, which is clearly very possible for a nominal phrase, a complete macro projection, you would get to over 3.5 million combinations of elements. But once again, if you calculate the actual units that make up the nominal phrase, not everything is on the same level as a modifier of the noun, but they constitute smaller units where you have a different head for each unit. Then you at most arrive at 500, not 3 million or something. This is a rough calculation. To conclude, let me just say that what we saw is the possibility of building a restrictive theory, namely a theory that really aims at arriving at to the derivation of what we actually find in the languages of the world, while excluding everything else. This is I think, the task of any scientific theory, where it's more important what you exclude and is not found than what you allow. And if you pin down exactly to the things that you find on a special way of deriving them, excluding the rest, then I think you get a restrictive theory in that sense. What was crucial, as I said, is the fact that it's only the head of each projection, of each constituent that can move, whether it's a noun or the adjective or the verb or the classifier or the numeral and so on. And finally, something which I could not go over is the actual way of transforming a hierarchy, which I've been talking about, where you move things along the hierarchy to a linear order. And this we have in Keynes' so-called linear correspondent axiom, a simple way of obtaining a linear order from a hierarchy, because if something is higher, it will appear as to the left of something which is lower, essentially, to say it in simple words. Let me finish with a very speculative idea that has to do with something that Chomsky had proposed independently. Here we see him in Arizona, where he was more recently. Now, the question is, why do we find this bewildering variation in word order in all languages? I mean, in the languages of the world. Why universal grammar, if there is a universal grammar, does not dictate only one order for all languages? I mean, that's a possibility. Why don't we find that? Now, my hunch would be to say, exploiting one of Chomsky's proposals on different grounds, that this is a side effect of the free nature of movement. Because if movement is, as Chomsky says, comes for free in this particular way, so Chomsky essentially proposed that the structure of a sentence or another projection is actually due to two types of merge, of putting things together and building a larger phrase or a larger structure. And originally he had thought that the so-called external merge, when you take two things which you constructed, let's say a noun phrase and a verb phrase, you put them together and you get a sentence, simplifying. That's called external merge. But then he said there is another way of enlarging a structure, which consists in taking a subpart of one structure and moving this subpart to enlarge the same structure. So like in the examples I gave here, of which book have they read the first chapter, where of which book starts out, it's the object of the first chapter, but then moves up and enlarges the structure. And he says, this is more economical as a way of enlarging the structures. And he calls it internal merge, because you take something internal to an already existing structure and you move it up. And he says, given that it's more economical, it should be like free. It should be, and this actually has a side effect. The fact that if you let it free, even without, expecting that this movement may lead to interpretational difference, then you do get the enormous variation in word order with the restriction that I pointed out, but still movement seems to allow you an enormous number of possibilities that otherwise would not be possible. Okay, so that's very speculative, and I finished that. Here is okay.